They called it Pleasant Hill, a name soft enough to put you at ease, just long enough to walk through the gates, just long enough for the gates to lock behind you. From 1807 to 1836, this hidden religious community in Mercer County claimed to be a sanctuary from the world's corruption. Celibacy, obedience, labor, perfection. But the truth was never spoken, only whispered through journal fragments, sealed testimonies, and death records that vanished along with the people they belonged to. This isn't just a story about missing persons. This is about how power operates in silence, how it dresses itself in white robes and smiles while it breaks your will. Because Pleasant Hill wasn't abandoned overnight, it was hollowed out from within. And what filled that hollow wasn't God, it was a family, the Richardsons. From the outside, they looked like spiritual stewards, pious, gentle, devout, but inside their immaculate white meeting houses and prayer circles, they operated a totalitarian social experiment decades before modern psychology ever had a name for what they were doing. Every person inside Pleasant Hill was watched, every letter read, every moment of eye contact calculated. And then people started vanishing. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. It began with questions about finances, about inconsistent records, about why a furniture workshop reported 50 craftsmen but produced the output of 15, about why certain names disappeared from the attendance logs but were never mentioned again, why the ground near the orchard was always being tilled but never planted. What I'm about to show you isn't on the History Channel. It isn't in the museum pamphlets. This is the shadow behind the curtain of American religious history, where spiritual purity was weaponized into a system of psychological domination. But understand this, once you see what really happened inside Pleasant Hill, you won't unsee it, because the systems they built never actually ended. They just changed names. And if you think this only happened in the 1800s, you're already in the second phase of control. They called him Elder Samuel. But behind closed doors, the name that held sway was the architect. Not of buildings, those were just distractions. Samuel Richardson was the architect of control. He didn't arrive at Pleasant Hill like the others, poor, grieving, searching for meaning. He arrived with a plan, a tall man with silver gray eyes that never blinked during a conversation. His voice could lull an audience into tears or silence a crowded hall with one word. He claimed direct lineage from Mother Ann Lee's disciples, but no records from New York or Massachusetts could ever verify that. Still, people believed, because belief is easier than questioning a man who speaks like God listens to him personally. The community had been small before his arrival, scattered families and fervent idealists barely scraping by. But in just 3 years under Samuel's guidance, Pleasant Hill tripled in size. Fields were cleared, dormitories constructed, order imposed, and a new doctrine emerged, one that demanded not just devotion, but surrender. His wife, Sister Martha, renounced their marriage publicly, in accordance with Shaker celibacy. But insiders knew better. She still visited his quarters at night, sometimes in silence, sometimes weeping. What passed between them was not romance. It was power consolidation. Martha was the spider in the web. She remembered every face, every slight, every confession whispered in trust. If Samuel was the architect, Martha was the enforcer of compliance. Together they raised their children not as individuals, but as functionaries in a family machine. Ezekiel, Caleb, Rebecca, Patience, each assigned to a sphere of control: agriculture, surveillance, psychological indoctrination, document forensics, each one a specialist, each one loyal beyond reason. That's how the vanishing began, not through violence, but structure. You didn't disappear overnight. First, your tasks were reassigned. Then your meals arrived late. Then your letters were delayed or went unanswered. One night, you might be called to evening prayer with Sister Rebecca for alignment. If you resisted, Brother Caleb would escort you, gently, but firmly. The next day, you wouldn't be seen. No burial, no announcement. Just a moment of silence, and then your name scrubbed from every record. Your possessions redistributed. Your existence converted into myth. The system worked because no one outside the family had the full picture. Each member saw only what they were allowed to see, like insects in a jar watching each other, too afraid to ask why the air was getting thinner. That's the seduction most men don't recognize until it's too late. You're not lured by threats. You're drawn in by the promise of meaning. In a world that feels hollow, Pleasant Hill offered order, certainty, a life beyond the chaos of the frontier, the rot of city life, the sickness of sin. They didn't take your freedom. They asked you to give it willingly. And men did. Hundreds of them. They signed away their land. their businesses, their families, all in pursuit of divine clarity. Because Samuel knew something fundamental: when men are lost, they crave structure more than salvation. And he gave it to them down to the minute. The day began at 4:30 a.m. You rose to the sound of Brother Caleb's bell. Not an alarm, a tone drilled so deep into your nervous system that waking became an act of submission. Meals were plain but precise. Beans, grains, bread. No stimulation. Just fuel for obedience. Work rotations were designed by Ezekiel, a master not of crops but of containment. You weren't just farming, you were being programmed. Tasks rotated so frequently that no deep bonds could form. You moved like pieces on a chessboard, all by design. Relationships were shallow. Introspection discouraged. Solitude was permitted only under supervision. Evenings were worse. Samuel's sermons blended scripture with subtle psychological dismantling. Guilt became virtue. Doubt became sin. Sister Martha would sit in the front row, hands folded, eyes locked on each member, watching who drifted, who averted their gaze, who flinched at key phrases. Behind her, Rebecca took notes. Detailed, color-coded, cross-referenced with reports from patients, who by then could forge handwriting so convincingly. She once sent a letter to a mother in Ohio pretending to be her son 2 weeks after he'd vanished. This was the system: total observation, total control. You weren't a believer. You were data. If you broke down, if your spirit wavered, the family called it fracturing. And they had protocols. You'd be reassigned to isolation duties, cleaning the root cellar, sorting seeds in the silent barn, until you either conformed or disappeared. And still, new members came, because nothing spreads faster than a man desperate for belonging. And Pleasant Hill sold belonging like a drug, one dose at a time, until the man you were no longer existed. There was no barbed wire, no guard towers, no iron gates. But make no mistake, Pleasant Hill was a prison. It was built not with stone, but with language. They called it the discipline of grace. A phrase repeated like scripture in sermons, meetings, kitchen halls. It meant obedience disguised as spiritual refinement. And it worked, not because it was true, but because it sounded true. That's the deadliest kind of lie, the one that feels righteous when it binds you. If you broke a rule, like speaking during silent labor, asking for old letters, or even pausing too long in your reading, you weren't punished immediately. You were invited to a quiet meeting with Sister Rebecca. Her tone was calm, her face soft, but her eyes dissected you like a surgeon. She never accused, she asked questions, innocent ones, disarming ones, until you offered your own guilt on a silver platter. And then, like magic, your punishment became your penance. Samuel called this alignment. Martha called it spiritual calibration. But Rebecca, she called it shaping. And it was shaping in the clinical sense. Behavioral modification with religious camouflage. Over time, you began to modify yourself. You anticipated correction. You self-censored. You told on others, not out of malice, but from fear of being associated with doubt. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You sang hymns in the morning after witnessing someone removed in the night. And then came the moment of breakage, different for every man. For some, it was the discovery that their letters had never reached home. For others, it was realizing that their names were slowly disappearing from logs, like chalk erased without trace. But the most chilling break came when they realized this: no one outside was coming, because Brother Nathan Richardson had taken care of that. With his polished boots, handwritten donations, and weekly visits to local churches, he had built a wall of goodwill between Pleasant Hill and the outside world. The sheriff called the community moral fortress. Local merchants offered them discounts for their purity. No one would ever believe you, not even your own family, if you were allowed to write to them at all. The moment you understood that something inside you died, and that's when you became invisible. Still breathing, still working, but erased. A ghost in a system too holy to question. But at Pleasant Hill, they did. Through the cracks in the walls, the pages that survived the burnings, the memories of those few who escaped with their minds intact. And the story they told wasn't of holy devotion, it was of a machine. Because that's what the Richardson family built, a spiritual industrial engine designed to consume human lives and convert them into wealth, influence, and untraceable silence. Brother Jeremiah ran the workshops. To visitors, they were temples of craftsmanship. Elegant tables, carved rocking chairs, meticulous cabinetry. But behind the closed doors, the truth was different. Members worked 12-hour shifts in near silence. Hands blistered, backs bent, tools dulled from overuse. And if you slowed production, You were sent to reflection duty, cleaning latrines and slaughter pens until your soul had realigned. Brother Isaiah ran the seed trade, a perfect front. Agriculture gave them access to hundreds of remote farms across 3 states. But that wasn't all he distributed. Testimonies hint at packages, delivered to isolated barns. Certain families in Tennessee and Indiana who suddenly prospered after a visit from Isaiah. Records show shipments marked seed that never arrived at any known destination. What was really being traded? Influence, secrets, possibly even bodies. But the true masterpiece was the record-keeping. Sister Patience, only 24, kept the web intact. She forged letters that kept families hopeful. She created membership ledgers that always showed the right number of people, even when entire dormitories were empty. Her skill was terrifying. A member could vanish on Monday, and by Thursday, their handwriting would appear on a cheerful letter postmarked to Cincinnati, thanking their parents for spiritual clarity. Every death was peaceful, every concern worldly, every disappearance transition, and the system rewarded loyalty. Compliant members received better food, warmer beds, lighter work. Their names were read during morning prayers. Their letters, the real ones, sometimes made it home. It created a hierarchy of obedience. Men turned on each other, not from hatred, but to survive. They reported whispers, second glances, the way someone hesitated at the lunch line. Because in Pleasant Hill, suspicion was currency, and those who collected enough suspicion, they became the next departure. Not martyred, not punished, just gone, and somewhere deep in the root cellar, the orchard, or the sealed northern well, their stories ended where the records refused to go. By 1815, Pleasant Hill had perfected its illusion. Visitors came from as far as New York to witness what newspapers called the future of American piety. They marveled at the spotless dormitories, the harmonic singing, the clockwork routines. Clergymen praised the Richardson family for their divine order. Judges dined in the communal hall, shaking hands with Ezekiel. Senators received handcrafted desks bearing Brother Jeremiah's signature stamp. They all saw what they were meant to see, and nothing more. Because Pleasant Hill had mastered the second principle of total control, you don't hide the truth, you bury it beneath a better story. And the best story they sold was progress, spiritual advancement, moral superiority. But behind the hymns and harvest, the attrition continued. Quiet, steady, statistical. By now, over 24 members had vanished, each with the same pattern: a private concern voiced to the wrong person, a shift in their assignment, further from the central buildings, a final appearance at evening worship, and then absence. The disappearances were paced deliberately, one every few months, just slow enough not to alert the average observer. But for those who were counting, like Sister Mary Caldwell, a dangerous pattern had begun to emerge. Mary wasn't a rebel. She was a servant by nature, soft-spoken, diligent, a cleaner of the dormitories since age 16. She never questioned orders, but she noticed details. Missing linens, abandoned shoes, scratched initials inside wooden bedposts. She kept records. Not in books. That would have been suicide. But on scraps of laundry tags and prayer slips, coded. Hidden, her data showed a discrepancy of over 60 members by the end of 1816. And yet, all reports still listed 389 active residents. One winter night, she shared her suspicions with a trusted friend, Brother Elias, a groundskeeper with a limp and a gentle heart. The next morning, Elias was transferred to the orchard team, a known punishment detail. By sundown, he was relocated to another Shaker village, according to Samuel's announcement. Mary never saw him again. She stopped speaking entirely after that, not out of fear, but clarity. She understood now you don't fight a system like this head on. You infiltrate it, slowly, quietly, like a knife beneath the robes. Her notes survived, smuggled out years later, hidden inside the lining of a hymnal cover. And those notes are how we know this wasn't just spiritual abuse. It was institutional elimination, masquerading as enlightenment. The key to understanding Pleasant Hill isn't in what they believed. It's in what they needed others to believe. You see, belief was just the front. The real engine was control, psychological, economic, physical. But control on its own is never enough. You have to wrap it in something divine. You have to make obedience feel like salvation. You have to make submission feel sacred. Samuel Richardson understood this perfectly. He wasn't just a cult leader. He was a tactician of the soul. He engineered his sermons like blueprints: first, a passage from Scripture, then a lesson on spiritual hierarchy, then a subtle reminder that God speaks through order, not through questions. And finally, always a story of someone who had doubted and paid the price. Fear was layered beneath ritual, the singing, the synchronized movements, the silent meals. These weren't traditions, they were conditioning tools. Every act reinforced that your body didn't belong to you. Your mind didn't belong to you. Even your memories could be rewritten. That's why every member underwent what they called the renewal process. At the 6-month mark, it sounded holy, cleansing, but it was really a psychological reset. You were removed from your normal duties for a full week, isolated, interviewed daily by Sister Rebecca and Martha, asked about your dreams, your thoughts during prayer, your moments of doubt. At first, they encouraged honesty. Then they used it against you. Did you think about a woman? You're not spiritually pure. Did you miss your family? You're not fully surrendered. Did you question a sermon? You're resisting God's design. By the end of the week, you emerged humbled, reconstructed, and most importantly, compliant. You confessed things that weren't even true, just to please them. And that's when they knew they had you. Because a man who'll lie against himself to survive is already owned. And if you resisted the process, they didn't punish you. They isolated you further. No eye contact, no assignments, no prayer circle. You became a shadow until you broke or vanished. This wasn't a church. It wasn't even a cult. It was a behavioral lab in the guise of a holy village. And the Richardsons, they weren't shepherds. They were scientists of spiritual erasure. By the spring of 1818, Pleasant Hill had achieved something most would call impossible: absolute harmony. Not the kind that grows naturally, not the kind you find in faith or family. This was manufactured harmony, artificial, programmed. Visitors noted the glow in members' eyes, the quiet peace that settled over the village like a soft fog. What they didn't realize is that it wasn't peace, it was surrender. And that surrender came at a price: identity. Each member had a name when they arrived, a history, a set of memories that made them human. But by the time they passed through 6 months of renewal, that identity was gone. You weren't James or Robert anymore. You were Brother 17A. You didn't work for your dreams. You worked for the greater order. You didn't think. You received thoughts, delivered through sermons, instructions, daily prayers, and silence. Silence was everywhere. Meals were silent. Morning labor was silent. Even confessions were spoken in whispers, as if God were allergic to volume. The only time voices rose in unison was during hymns, and even those were modified over time. Traditional Shaker songs were rewritten by Sister Martha to remove personal pronouns. Ian became when, us. Individuality was erased, one verse at a time. But the deeper transformation was neurological. Former members who escaped described something chilling. Their thoughts stopped sounding like their own. They began hearing Samuel's phrases in their inner voice. Phrases like, doubt is disorder, or questions are pride in disguise. This wasn't inspiration. This was implanted programming. One brother, years later, broke down in a Tennessee infirmary, saying, even now, I still wait for the bell before I eat. I still sleep on my side so I don't dream. I still fold my hands when I'm afraid, like she taught us. She, Sister Rebecca. Her counseling sessions were the final layer, the place where raw identity was carved into a perfect vessel. She didn't shout. She never struck. She simply asked questions until you betrayed yourself and then thanked her for it. Many left those sessions changed forever. Some never spoke again, and some never left at all. Because by this point, the machine didn't need cages. It had reprogrammed the mind to build its own. But what the Richardson family perfected at Pleasant Hill was something deeper. Reality erasure. Not just manipulating what you thought, but deleting the very foundation of how you think. By 1819, the family had developed what they called the Trinity of Correction. 3 phases every dissenting member was forced to endure before their fate was sealed. Phase 1, reflection. You're isolated, given only a Bible and blank paper, forbidden to speak. Meals are reduced. You're told, this is a time for the Lord to search your heart. No one tells you how long it will last. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks. You begin to question what you did wrong. Then you begin to question if you did anything wrong. Then you forget you were ever right. Phase 2, realignment. You're brought to Sister Martha or Rebecca. They call it spiritual counseling, but in practice, it's memory destabilization. They ask you to recount the events that brought you into correction. Then they retell the same events with subtle changes, over and over, until your memory and their version begin to blur, until you agree with them, even when you don't understand why. And when you finally nod, smile, and say, yes, I see now, I was resisting order. You're ready for the final phase. Phase 3 reassignment. You're not just returned to the community. You're repurposed. Your name is changed slightly. Your dorm is different. Your daily assignments are altered. Old friends are told you. Transition to deeper labor. You're instructed to avoid speaking of your correction, to avoid using personal stories, to report any who question your absence. In effect, you're dead. But your body continues. The others see it happen. They don't say a word because they know the next time it could be them. This wasn't just cult behavior. It was systemic psychological warfare. And it worked because it was slow, clinical, clean. By now, Pleasant Hill had over 70 reassigned members, men and women walking through fields and dining halls like ghosts wearing new names, hollowed out, smiling, whispering prayers written by people long dead. And every time one of them passed through the chapel doors, the Richardson family smiled, because obedience to them was never the goal. Transformation was. There are moments in every system of control when the illusion wavers, brief fractures where the truth leaks through. At Pleasant Hill, that moment came in the summer of 1821. It started with a child. Sister Naomi was 14 when she arrived, daughter of a grieving war widow from Virginia, handed over to the community in hopes that a life of structure and prayer would straighten her mind and quiet the voices. That's how they described her: difficult, imaginative, prone to speaking with unseen things. But Naomi saw what others were trained to ignore. She noticed which dorm rooms were suddenly sealed. She watched who never returned from orchard duty. She drew pictures in the dirt, in the margins of hymn books, behind wash basins, of members with hollow eyes standing in lines before empty doors. She didn't speak much. But when she did, she asked questions that made the adults nervous. Why doesn't Sister Agnes eat anymore? Where does Brother Jonah go when the bell rings twice? Why do the night shadows move different in the East Wing? By August, her drawings had been found, disturbing images scratched beneath the chapel pews. One depicted the Richardson family with animal faces, Samuel as a wolf, Rebecca as a vulture, Caleb faceless. Another showed dormitory beds with ropes instead of blankets. Sister Martha called her possessed of spiritual chaos. Samuel called her an anomaly. And so the family decided to intervene. Naomi was placed under guided supervision, a gentle-sounding program reserved for members considered dangerously perceptive. She was paired with sister patients who began rewriting Naomi's journal in real time. Pages were torn, memories revised. Naomi's own words were restructured into confessions. But Naomi didn't break. She grew quieter, yes, but more precise. Her final drawing, discovered years later behind a rotting chapel board, showed the interior of the east well, stone steps descending, candlelight, and beneath that 7 names scratched into stone. All were listed in Pleasant Hill's earliest ledgers. All had mysteriously departed. None had been seen again. Shortly after, Naomi fell ill. That's what the record says. Sister Martha tended to her personally. She was buried within 24 hours. No cause given. But here's what chills the blood at the base of Naomi's grave marker. Barely visible now is a single carved phrase: "They lie in water. They lie in water." 3 words etched by a dying girl, ignored by the living, erased by the records. But they were a crack in the illusion. Because if Naomi was right, if the missing were being buried not in earth, but in water, then Pleasant Hill's beauty wasn't just hiding manipulation, it was hiding murder. The east well sat just beyond the orchard, a stone structure always padlocked. Its water was never used for drinking or irrigation. When asked, members were told it was spiritually consecrated, reserved for rituals only the elders could understand. But what kind of ritual needs silence and secrecy? What kind of sacred water smells faintly of rust? In 1823, 2 boys, Elijah and Simon, were assigned to orchard duty after being caught whispering during meal prep. They were only 12, assigned without supervision, likely as a test of loyalty. But they wandered. Curiosity, the one sin Pleasant Hill feared most, pulled them to the east well. The padlock on that day hadn't latched completely. They lifted the lid. What they found was never recorded in official documents. But Simon spoke of it in a fever 2 years later, long after Elijah had run away and disappeared. He said there were bones, not scattered, stacked neatly, deliberately below the waterline. He described fabric shaker robes weighed down with stones, a wooden crucifix carved with 7 initials. He was moved to a different dorm that same week. Simon stopped speaking completely by age 15. When asked why, he scratched 3 words into a wooden bedpost before he was caught and beaten. Below, they sing, The well was resealed, its lid reinforced. Orchard duty became a supervised role, and those who even glanced toward the stone ring during prayer walks were reassigned to labor duties further north. The Richardsons knew. They always knew. Because this wasn't a spontaneous horror. It was infrastructure. Disposal had been built into the design. A place where bodies could vanish without trace. Where questions ended in darkness. Where history drowned, and still the visitors came. Still the churches praised. Still the state signed documents approving their expansion. Because by now, Pleasant Hill wasn't just a hidden system. And the price of that protection was 317 souls. By 1825, Pleasant Hill was no longer a community. It was a kingdom. The Richardsons ruled it with precision, grace, and an unshakable calm that masked the blood beneath their boots. And those on the outside, they called it a miracle. Newspapers praised the community's divine unity. Ministers marveled at the purity of their doctrine. State officials nodded with approval. Signatures flowing as easily as the donations that followed. Because Samuel had learned the oldest secret of power, you don't need to silence everyone, just the right ones. He had made Pleasant Hill indispensable. They produced the region's finest furniture, best seeds, purest dried herbs. Hospitals used their teas. Judges sat in their chairs. Churches displayed their hand-carved pulpits. Their reputation was a fortress built not from stone, but from usefulness. And within that fortress, horrors could flourish. The disappearances continued, slowly, rhythmically, always explained, never investigated. One brother sent to help build a new Shaker outpost in Indiana, never heard from again. One sister, called to contemplative life in the northern cottage, which no member had entered in months. A visiting tanner from Harrodsburg remembered seeing 20 young women during a tour. A week later, he returned and counted 15. When he mentioned the difference, Brother Nathan laughed and said, "The eyes see what the spirit is ready for." That phrase would later appear in letters penned by at least 6 different members. The same phrase, the same wording, the same punctuation, all forged, all crafted by Sister Patience. Because by now, the deception was generational. Children raised inside the hill never knew the outside world. They were told the cities had fallen into fire, that outsiders were diseased, that only within the hill was salvation possible. Their maps were drawn with Pleasant Hill at the center and everything else labeled disordered land. And the children who resisted, they vanished faster than the adults, because a child who questions too early is harder to reshape, easier to remove, easier to fold into the bottom of the east well. But here's the darkest part, it worked. By 1825, no one questioned. No one resisted. The hill operated like a watch wound by the hand of something ancient and cold. And the cost of that order was silence. Total, unbreakable, holy silence. Not just a lack of words, but a living presence, a force, and a ritualized absence. And at Pleasant Hill, silence wasn't peace, it was compliance. By 1827, the silence had thickened into something tangible. You could feel it in the halls, in the spaces between footsteps, in the way no one made eye contact for more than a breath. Even worship became quieter, more choreographed. Every glance, every movement calculated to avoid notice, because notice was the beginning of death. It wasn't just the Richardsons watching anymore. It was everyone. Spying had become culture. Reporting was sacred duty. Children informed on their parents. Sisters wrote down whispers overheard in the latrines. Brothers traded secrets for lighter chores, warmer blankets. There were no conversations anymore, only surveillance. Brother Caleb formalized the system. He introduced what he called the accountability matrix, a grid pairing every member with a silent observer. It rotated weekly. You never knew who watched you next. Everyone was being watched, and everyone was the watcher. This did something to the mind. You began to correct yourself mid-thought. Not mid-action, mid-thought. Should I ask about Sister Naomi's grave? No. Even thinking that is pride. Even your dreams started to feel like betrayal. Former members, those few who escaped in the final years, described dreams filled with walls, endless corridors of wooden walls and doors that led back to the same place. Some saw faces familiar, eyeless, mouthing the word, stay. One man said he couldn't remember his own name unless he closed his eyes and counted backward from 317. That number, it kept surfacing. In the margins of meeting notes, scratched on a barn beams, scribbled beneath a hymn book shelf, 317 were taken. Not gone, taken. No one knows where the number came from. But it circulated like a ghost, an unspoken truth beneath the mountain of lies. Some members feared it. Others whispered it in the dark. A few carved it into their skin, desperate to hold onto reality before the system erased it. The Richardsons never acknowledged it, but their eyes narrowed every time it was found. And those who spoke it out loud, even once, vanished within a day. You see, the greatest heresy at Pleasant Hill wasn't disbelief. It was remembering. It's time we talk about the night the bells rang twice. It happened in the dead of winter, 1829. A blizzard had swallowed the surrounding hills. No visitors, no mail, no movement beyond the gates, just wind howling like a voice too ancient to name. That night, every bell in Pleasant Hill rang once, the usual call to evening worship, then silence, then a second ring, off rhythm, too slow, too heavy. It hadn't happened before, not in anyone's memory. Some thought it was a mistake. Others felt it in their bones. The system had glitched. Something was off. Members gathered in the chapel, confused but obedient. Sister Rebecca stood at the pulpit, smiling, but Samuel didn't appear. Minutes passed. Then Brother Caleb entered, visibly shaken. He walked to Martha and whispered something that turned her skin to stone. Her voice never raised, but she gave a single nod. What happened next was not worship. The doors were locked from the inside. Men and women separated into rows. Names were called, slowly, rhythmically, 19 in total. Each one stood trembling. Each was led to the altar. Rebecca touched their foreheads. "Cleansed," she whispered, and then they were taken out the rear door. No explanation, no return. One sister, Lydia Hale, was among them, a healer, trusted, quiet. She had seen too much, known too much that morning. She'd written a phrase in the margin of a journal she was never meant to keep. "I remember Naomi. I remember the well. I remember 307 tying." That journal was never found, but a torn scrap of it survived, folded into the hem of her work apron. Discovered years later in an archive donation box at a Louisville church. The back of that scrap said only, "If the bells ring twice, do not speak. Do not move. Do not trust your memory. They can hear it now." After that night, rules changed. Worship times were staggered. Names were no longer used aloud. Only numbers. Eye contact was reduced by decree. Even smiles were discouraged because something had broken. The illusion cracked. The machine still moved, but it had become aware of its own seams. And the Richardsons knew the truth. Awareness spreads like fire. So they did what all fragile empires do. They tightened the grip, and behind every hymn, every handshake, every silent prayer was the growing fear that the bells might ring twice again. If you've made it this far, you're already past the point of no return. You feel it, don't you? Something inside you isn't just listening. It's waking up, because this story was never just about Pleasant Hill. It's about the design, the methods they used. Deprivation, obedience, reprogramming, and forced harmony didn't die with the Richardsons. They didn't vanish with the burning of records or the silence of state officials. They evolved. They scaled. Pleasant Hill was a prototype, and if you think it was the only one, you're not paying attention. Every mechanism they used is still used. Every method of reshaping thought, still active. Every tool of control, refined. Your media doesn't call it the Trinity of Correction. It calls it rehabilitation. It calls it behavioral therapy. It calls it re-education. And the silence, it's louder now. Smiling news anchors, curated timelines, carefully placed outrage, endless noise to prevent you from hearing the signal. They learned from the Richardsons. They studied them. The U.S. Psychological Warfare Division, founded in the 1940s, quietly obtained copies of surviving Pleasant Hill documents. That's not theory. That's traceable. Those files were referenced in classified case studies on long-term identity suppression. Why? Because the Hill proved you don't need chains to enslave a mind. You just need isolation, ritual, repetition, and the constant suggestion that obedience is love. And you've felt it before in school, in certain churches, in workplaces where the fluorescent lights hum like hymns. You've had moments, short, sharp, where you realize your thoughts aren't your own, where you say something and wonder, who taught me to speak like that? It starts small, then it spreads. That's why I need you to do something. Right now. Comment the phrase, "I will not forget the 317. Write it twice. Write it for yourself. Write it so the algorithm knows you're not asleep. This isn't entertainment. This is warfare by other means, and you're either a subject of the system or you're waking up from it. By the time outsiders began asking questions, it was already too late. The rot had roots too pristine, and the names, the real names, had long been erased or rewritten. But in 1830, a single misstep opened a crack in the wall. It came from Ohio. A state inspector named Gerald Ransom sent to evaluate land holdings related to a cross-border inheritance dispute. Harmless on the surface. Bureaucratic, routine. But Ransom had a flaw the Richardsons didn't anticipate. He noticed everything. He arrived with papers detailing land transfers involving a man named Elias Brandt, listed in federal archives as deceased in 1822. But Pleasant Hill's internal registry still showed him as active in service. Ransom questioned it. Brother Nathan smiled, offered tea, and said, "We keep records of all who've served with us as part of our spiritual lineage." But Ransom wasn't convinced. He began requesting additional names, cross-checking death records, comparing census data. That week, a storm delayed his departure, giving him extra time to wander the grounds. He found the East Wing boarded up. He found work ledgers with identical handwriting across multiple names. He found a burial record dated 5 years prior, for a woman still working in the Herb house. And most damning of all, in a forgotten drawer of the ledger room, he found a stack of sealed letters written by family members searching for loved ones who had joined the Shakers and were never heard from again. Names, dates, desperation. One note read, "We were told Sarah Caldwell was thriving, but no one has heard her voice in 6 years. Please, in Christ's name, send proof she lives." Ransom confronted Samuel with the letter. Samuel responded with calm concern, then invited him to dinner. That night, Ransom fell violently ill. He left Pleasant Hill 2 days later, pale, shaken, and silent. But he made one decision they didn't expect. He didn't go home. He traveled east, straight to a federal circuit office in Lexington. And there, despite nausea and paranoia creeping behind his eyes, he submitted a sealed deposition that would vanish from public record for nearly 190 years. He wrote, "There are no prisoners at Pleasant Hill. And yet I've never seen such a vast, organized captivity in all my years. Their minds are gone. Their voice is not their own. Something lives under that place, and it drinks silence. There's something most people don't understand about evil. It doesn't arrive like a beast. It doesn't kick down doors. It smiles. It dresses in white. It folds its hands during prayer. It speaks softly and quotes scripture and sings in tune with everyone else. The true horror of Pleasant Hill wasn't what happened in secret. It was what happened in plain sight. You could walk through its orchards, touch its polished furniture, hear the harmony of its hymns, and never suspect you were standing on the graves of 317 human souls. But by 1831, the cracks had widened. Not publicly, no. The Richardsons still controlled perception like puppet strings. But internally, their grip was slipping. Something was wrong beneath the surface. Patterns no longer held. Conversions slowed. Sleepwalking members began speaking in their dreams. Some wept during work and didn't know why. One sister stood in the Herb house and began tearing every label off the jars, screaming, "The names are wrong. The names are wrong." Brother Ezekiel personally restrained her. She was never seen again. The system, perfect for 2 decades, was unraveling under the weight of its own suppression. And then came the boy. His name isn't in any records, but the last living descendant of a Shaker courier swore his grandfather met him once, hidden in the back of a merchant cart heading north out of Kentucky. He was maybe 10. Gaunt, wide-eyed, dirt under his fingernails. But when the courier asked where he came from, the boy said only, "I'm not from there anymore. I remembered too much." He handed the courier a bundle of paper, dozens of pages, names, dates, symbols, a hand-drawn map of the East Wing, and beneath it, what looked like a well. The boy vanished that night. Some say he escaped north. Others say he was taken back. But those pages, they survived. They passed through hymnals, library Bibles, between floorboards of shuttered churches. Some say a few were recovered during a private auction in 1974. Others claim parts ended up in the Library of Congress under restricted classification. What matters is this: they contained proof. Proof the official narrative was a lie. Proof the disappearances were deliberate. Proof the silence wasn't peace. It was a design. And every person who read those pages claimed they felt something watching them afterward. Something that still listens for the number 317. The disappearance of 317 people isn't just a tragedy. It's a map, a pattern etched into the American subconscious, repeating itself, hiding behind new names, new buildings, new ideologies. Because what Pleasant Hill proved is that when control becomes sacred, cruelty becomes invisible. And in 1832, the pattern advanced. That year, 3 entire families vanished from community records within a single season. Gone, erased, no public funerals, no travel records, no letters sent. These were not isolated converts. They were multi-generational Shaker bloodlines, people with history, skills, belief, and still they vanished. The community was told they'd been called to serve in new settlements forming further west. But no such settlements were registered, and their names never appeared on any other Shaker rosters in the United States. The children of those families weren't even mentioned again, as if the community had collectively decided to forget them. Except one man didn't forget, Brother Elias Thorne, a carpenter, quiet, steady, loyal until the night his youngest daughter, Sister Miriam, stopped singing during evening prayer. She was only 9. For 2 days after that, she walked the hill silently, her eyes sunken, her hands shaking. When Elias pressed her, she whispered, "They showed me what's below. They said I had to sing so I wouldn't hear it." That night, Elias made a decision no man had ever survived. He went into the East Wing alone. According to fragments of his journal recovered decades later, he found the sealed access to the underground spring chamber, what we now believe was the true foundation of the East Well system. It wasn't just for disposal. It was for ritual. The pages described symbols carved into stone, a hollow chamber beneath the well mouth, and water that moved even when the wind was still. Elias never escaped. His body was never found. But the next morning, the community woke to a single word painted in red across the chapel door. Remember? No one spoke of it. No one cleaned it. It remained for 6 days before Brother Caleb personally sanded the wood down and replaced the entire door frame. And still the memory lingered, quietly, like mold beneath paint. The Richardsons doubled surveillance, accelerated spiritual alignments, restricted child access to communal spaces, and yet whispers continued, because the silence was failing, not from outside, from within. By 1833, Pleasant Hill had become a stage, one built on suffering, lit by false light, and run by performers who no longer believed their own script. The Richardsons had ruled for 26 years, but something had shifted. They weren't controlling the system anymore. The system was controlling them. Samuel's sermons grew erratic. He began repeating phrases. Order is the only God. The water remembers. Their silence is heavier now. Witnesses, those few who would later speak, said his voice trembled when the wind rose, especially near the orchard. He'd stop mid-prayer and glance toward the east well as if listening. Martha withdrew almost entirely. She stopped overseeing convert orientation. Her face was rarely seen in daylight. Some claimed she walked the dormitory halls barefoot after midnight, whispering the names of children who had gone into the water. But it wasn't guilt. It was fear. The machine they'd built had fed on obedience for decades. Now it fed on memory, and those who remembered were disappearing faster than ever. That spring, 3 young men attempted to flee. Brothers John Tobias and Eli Marks, orphans taken in as infants and raised entirely within the community. They made it as far as the tree line before Brother Caleb found them. Only one returned, John, but something was wrong with him. He was pale, detached. He no longer recognized people he'd grown up with. When asked about his brothers, he'd blink, smile, and say, "What brothers?" He didn't remember trying to leave. He didn't remember anything from before that night. And on his right palm, someone had carved the number 318. The implications were horrifying. Not only was the number different, one higher than before, it suggested the system had changed its rules. It was no longer hiding the number of the taken. It was counting forward. Someone, or something, was still watching, still recording. And perhaps the Richardsons had once controlled it, but now they were prisoners too, wardens trapped in their own labyrinth, caretakers of a silence that had grown larger than them. Because the truth no one could admit, not even in thought, was this: the hill no longer belonged to the Richardsons. It belonged to the thing beneath. Shall we go further into section 20? The final year was a slow collapse disguised as order. No fires, no rebellion, no headlines. Just a tightening, so gradual most never felt it until they were already gone. By spring, only 213 members remained, yet the record still claimed 389. The difference? Vanished. Not moved. Not transferred. Not deceased. Just gone. Samuel no longer gave sermons. He sat in the chapel alone, facing the east wall, whispering a language no one recognized. His once commanding voice had become a rasp, dry and cracked like the bark of the orchard trees. He spoke of the memory beneath the roots, of voice that echoes without air. Martha hadn't left her quarters in over a month. And the others, the faithful, they kept singing, kept marching, kept obeying, because to stop was to feel, and to feel was to break. But there was one moment, a single moment, when the truth nearly broke through. June 12th, A boy named Isaiah Clay, 13 years old, stood during breakfast and began screaming. Not words, not cries, a sound like stone breaking underwater, then silence, then a whisper. They're not buried. 3 words. They froze the room. No one moved. No one spoke, because they all felt it, a shift, like a string pulled tight inside the center of Pleasant Hill, snapping. That night, the east well overflowed. It had never done that before. Water rushed up through the stone ring, flooding the orchard path. The air stank of metal and rot. The livestock screamed. 3 sisters vomited simultaneously without warning. And above the well on the oak tree once used for rope swings in summer shady was a message carved freshly into the bark. The silence feeds. Caleb ordered the area cordoned off, but it was too late. The illusion was over. Too many had seen. Too many had felt it. The next morning, the Richardsons were gone. No goodbye. No note, no final sermon. Their rooms were empty, their belongings untouched, their clothing folded neatly at the foot of each bed, all of them. Samuel, Martha, Caleb, Rebecca, Patience, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Hannah, Sarah, Nathan. Doors open. Candles still lit, only the east well cover had been disturbed, slightly ajar. Damp fingerprints on the edge, deep unnatural scratches in the stone, the kind no human hand could make. July 1834, 2 sheriffs, a court clerk, and a physician from Mercer County arrived at Pleasant Hill under orders to investigate abandoned property and unclaimed commercial debts. They expected confusion, maybe illness, perhaps a break in leadership. What they found was perfect silence. Chairs still tucked under tables, bread still rising in kitchen hearths, work tools laid neatly beside half-finished furniture. Even the livestock remained fed, fresh grain in their troughs, clean water in their bowls, but not a single soul. No Richardsons, no brothers, no sisters, not even children, just 213 sets of shoes stacked outside dormitory doors, some pairs small enough to fit toddlers, all unlaced, all aligned. The state physician entered the chapel first. The smell of lavender and oak oil still hung in the air. A Bible sat open on the pulpit. Genesis 7:7-23. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out, only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. Behind the altar, the east wing door had been blown inward. Not broken, peeled. Like it had given way to pressure from beneath. The sheriff followed a trail of water down into the foundation, into the old spring chamber. The stones there were damp, scarred, and in the center of the well wall, carved deeper than any chisel should cut, was a number 3I-17. Only one other mark was found. A single symbol etched beside it. A circle, split by a vertical line. The same symbol that would later appear in the classified margins of the 1947 MK Ultra preliminary psychological behavior trials. And then, of course, the state sealed everything, declared it a health hazard, stated toxic spring gas, and structural instability. The remaining community assets were quietly absorbed. The land was auctioned, the buildings dismantled. No investigation, no prosecutions. No Forsen Hill disappeared exactly how it was designed to without a trace. But the people who came after, the historians, the skeptics, the wanderers, they kept finding fragments. A page hidden inside a false Bible cover. A handprint burned into the wood of a dormitory beam. A girl's braid buried in a wall with the number 317 sewn into the ribbon. And the feeling, undeniable to all who visited, that someone or something was still listening, waiting. For memory, for awakening. For you, when you forget something, where does it go? That name you can't recall. That dream you lost before waking. That sudden memory you're sure wasn't yours. Do they vanish? Or are they taken? Because the deeper we go into Pleasant Hill, the more one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just about control. It was about consumption. 317 people didn't simply vanish. They were fed into something. Something that required belief, memory, silence. And above all, obedience. And Pleasant Hill was the altar. Let's talk about the structure beneath the east well. The one only 2 maps ever mentioned. One burned in 1931, the other recovered from a private collector's estate in Maine. Wrapped in oilskin and tied with a red thread, it showed 6 levels, stone corridors, spiral staircases, a central chamber labeled only Resonance Hollow. No Shaker doctrine ever spoke of it. No property map acknowledged its existence. But the construction markings matched 1808 quarry logs from the Richardson supply route, indicating that excavation began in the first year of Pleasant Hill's founding. Why dig that deep? Why keep it secret from the very community built around it? Because it wasn't meant for them. It was meant for it. Whatever it is, it doesn't behave like myth. It doesn't demand worship or sacrifice in the way folklore teaches. It doesn't speak in tongues or bleed through mirrors. It absorbs voices, thoughts, Entire human narratives, rewritten or erased entirely. That's why no one remembers the 3 or 17. Not because they're forgotten, but because something else is wearing their stories. Think about it. How many times have you felt a hollow space inside your own memory? Something familiar you've never lived. An ache you can't explain. A face in a dream that felt too real. You might think that's just imagination, but what if it's residue? What if those who vanish don't leave, they leak? Leaking into dreams, into instincts, into the cracks in your mind when your guard is down. A voice behind your thoughts that says, don't look there. Don't dig deeper. Don't say 317. That voice, it isn't yours. There's a reason ancient temples were built over wells. There's a reason cathedrals stand atop older ruins. And there's a reason Pleasant Hill, disguised as a Shaker utopia, was constructed with perfect symmetry over an opening in the earth. Because openings aren't just physical, they're psychological. What the Richardsons discovered, intentionally or not, was that obedience is a key. Ritual is a key. Repetition, song, silence, work, prayer are all keys. And when enough keys turn in the right sequences, something opens. You need to understand the number 317 wasn't a count of the missing. It was a lock. Each person, each erased life, each willing surrender of identity was a mechanism, a dial being turned. And in the spring of 1834, that lock clicked open. We don't know what emerged, but we do know what changed afterward. The surrounding region, Mercer County and beyond, saw an explosion of unusual phenomena in the years following Pleasant Hill's abandonment. 17 reported cases of mass sleepwalking in nearby towns. Multiple orphanages reporting children speaking in unison about the black house beneath the trees. 4 separate disappearances of surveyors sent to chart the land. And the most chilling, a school teacher in 1842 who instructed her class to chant 317 keeps us clean before reciting scripture, until her arrest for spiritual coercion. None of these incidents were linked, not officially. But the symbol, that split circle, it showed up again, carved into the corner of a school desk in Boyle County. Scratched into the underside of a pew in Harrodsburg, found stitched into the hem of a burial cloth from an unmarked grave, unearthed in 1976, exactly 142 years after the final Pleasant Hill disappearance. You see, when memory is erased, the mind creates myths to cover the void. But when too much is erased, the mind starts to bleed. That's what's happening now, not just in Kentucky, not just in history, but in you. That ache you feel when no music plays, that shiver when silence gets too thick. That reflex to stop thinking when something's about to make sense. It's not fear, it's programming. And the deeper we go, the more you'll feel it push back. But you must not stop, because once you see how the lock turned, you'll understand what's about to be unleashed. Because if you're still watching, still listening, you're no longer just hearing a story. You're remembering something that was erased. And that makes you dangerous. See, the Pleasant Hill design wasn't limited to Kentucky. It was a template. The structure beneath the east well, 6 levels, central chamber, silence rituals, symbolic numerics, reappears across time and geography like a recurring infection beneath Zuyu Rich's abandoned cloister. Discovered in 1897, where 14 nuns reportedly, willingly unspoke their names. Inside a lost chamber under the St. Denis Basilica in France, closed after priests began forgetting entire years. And in Montauk, in a military installation officially decommissioned in 1969, where blueprints mention a room labeled simply Resonance Hollow. Same layout, same symbols, same number, 317, because it was never about the Shakers, or the Richardsons, or even Kentucky. They were just the first ones to build correctly, to calibrate every human life into an offering of precision. The chants, the fasting, the control, the isolation, all of it was about tuning frequencies. Your frequency. Think of memory like a transmission, a signal your soul sends to your mind. Now imagine something stronger, older, broadcasting on that same channel. Not to inform, to overwrite. And if you think this is superstition, think again. A declassified 1981 report from an MKGASA project describes group-controlled behavioral drift in isolated populations. The experimental method: remove stimuli, erase time cues, introduce numeric anchors tied to nonverbal ideologies. Exactly what Pleasant Hill did. The kicker: at the end of the report, one phrase was blacked out in every copy but one. A phrase written in the margin, underlined twice, 317 open. Awaiting signal. So here's where you make a choice. You can close this, forget, go back to sleep, or you can lock it in. Right now, in the comments, write this phrase twice. The silence ends with me. The silence ends with me. Say it aloud as you type it. Let the system know you're not a participant anymore. You're an interference, because the only thing the machine fears more than memory is a man who refuses to forget. Now listen carefully, because from here on, your perception won't return to what it was. Not because of fear, but because you've touched a forbidden pattern. Pleasant Hill was never just about the 317. That number wasn't the final count. It was the activation key. And once keyed, it didn't shut the system down. It expanded it. Let me explain. In 1835, 1 year after Pleasant Hill was found empty, a young surveyor named Thomas Elbridge was hired by the Kentucky Land Commission to redraw property boundaries for future sale. It should have been routine, but he never submitted his final report. What he left behind was found in his field journal, erratic entries, increasingly fragmented, filled with spirals, broken phrases, and this line repeated 7 times: "They don't walk in silence. They breathe it." His final sketch, a perfect spiral of the Pleasant Hill layout, but with one addition: a massive, subterranean ring, wider than the settlement itself, labeled only the Listening Belt. Since then, the land around Pleasant Hill has shifted. Forest has reclaimed much. The orchards have vanished. The foundations decayed. But the resonance remains. Modern electrical readings in the area show unexplainable EM fluctuations, particularly near what was once the East Wing Foundation. Paranormal investigators report missing time, spontaneous bleeding, and digital corruption. One man described hearing his dead father speaking to him through his own thoughts. But the most disturbing, a group of veterans who camped overnight near the site in 1998. All 5 reported the same dream: a deep room, water dripping, and hundreds of people standing in the dark, not moving, just watching. One man described it as a congregation of the forgotten, but they weren't trapped. They were waiting for instruction. That's what Pleasant Hill became. Not a grave, not a ruin, but a relay station built to echo something ancient through obedient flesh. And when the obedience ends, the signal shifts, and now that you know you are a carrier, the silence won't come for you like a demon. It will come slowly in your dreams, your memories, your moments of hesitation. It will feel like forgetting to breathe, like losing time. You must fight it by remembering, by speaking, by writing, because this story isn't over. It never was. 317 people didn't vanish. They became the network. And now that you've heard them, they've heard you. Now we come to the threshold, not the symbolic kind, the real one, the kind that doesn't care whether you believe. It only cares whether you've seen. And you have. That's why you're still here. You've glimpsed the edges of something so old, so embedded, it doesn't need to be hidden anymore. Because now it's remembered as fiction, which is the safest prison of all. Let's talk about the Echo Protocol, an unconfirmed file rumored to have been smuggled from a DARPA sub-network in 2002. It describes the psychological aftermath of exposure to resonant structures tied to pre-modern religious collectivism. Structures like Pleasant Hill. What does it say? That the human brain, when exposed to the architecture of control, symmetry, repetition, enclosed ritual, begins to restructure itself. Not randomly, not chaotically, but in preparation for something, an internal host environment. The file reads, suitable for memory replacement and external narrative implantation. In other words, the perfect vessel. That's why the 317 weren't killed. They were rewritten. Erased on the outside, repurposed on the inside, not just to forget who they were, but to become something else entirely. And now it's bigger than Pleasant Hill. It's in our media, our schools, our institutions of spiritual guidance. Because once the template works, once the resonance is tested, you replicate it, not with hoods and robes, but with apps, with attention rituals, with algorithmic obedience. Scroll, click, obey, forget, scroll, click, obey, forget. Tell me, when was the last time you sat in silence without needing something to fill it? That urge to distract yourself, that's not just boredom, it's displacement. A piece of you is missing, so something else can move in. And the proof is in the gaps. The face you swore you recognized in a stranger. The deja vu so strong it makes you nauseous. The moment of panic when you wake up knowing you were just somewhere else. Somewhere deep, damp, and waiting. You weren't dreaming. You were touching the network, and the network was watching you back. But survival is not victory. Awareness is not immunity. And descent is only the beginning of ascent if you choose to climb back up. But be warned. Once you've seen what's buried beneath Pleasant Hill, you carry it with you. You are now infected with truth. So here is the final piece, the one no document dared to include. The last testimony smuggled in the margins of an Ohio inspector's journal, never published, never acknowledged. Just 3 handwritten pages, unsigned, stained with rust and fear that sing beneath us. They do not scream, they do not speak, but they sing. But is not a song of joy, but of continuation. Every time a name is forgotten, the melody deepens. Every time a silence is accepted, the gates widen. And when enough men choose obedience over memory, the threshold opens again. You've seen the pattern now, not just at Pleasant Hill, but in your own world. Obedience packaged as virtue, silence rewarded with comfort, doubt punished as betrayal. It's not just a Shaker community that vanished. It's your history, your lineage of resistance, your inner voice, crushed beneath centuries of ritualized forgetting. And the most effective method, convince the population it never happened at all. So here we are, not at the end, but at the edge. You're standing where Samuel stood, where Martha wept, where 3 or 17 lives were rewritten into absence. The difference? You remember? You remember Thomas Wittmann's figures. You remember Sister Mary's almond sweet dread. You remember the sound of silence rising up from a well that should have stayed sealed. So now I ask for only one thing. A final act of rebellion. Take this story, twist it in your memory. Tell it wrong, tell it strangely, tell it in a whisper or a scream. But tell it, because memory that is shared cannot be erased, and silence, when broken, can never fully return.